Okay, guys, I have figured out what the issue was, and it's obviously, of course, it had to be something blatantly obvious, but it was basically something that you might miss yourself, and that's an important bit because I might save you a lot of time. Now, this is not the only purpose of this video, as to update you guys, but I wanted to show you a few more things that you might run into whenever you're making your own animation state machines and blueprints. So, first of all, this is what was wrong. The animation class is set to none, so I need to set it to P1 animation BP, meaning that something needs to drive it. And if I play this now, then we should have sort of the appropriate kind of like blueprint. Now you'll notice that it doesn't look as good as you might think, right? I mean, there's a lot of issues here. There's a lot of bugs. This whole thing is flying all over the place. This is mainly due to the fact that a lot of the things are set to loop. That's another thing I kind of forgot to change. So all you really have to do if you run into this issue is going to the whatever the offending animation and simply removing the loop animation. So you go to land. In this case, we don't want those to loop. Idle walk, of course, needs to be looping because that's the whole idea of walking, and it is very well loopable. Now, if I play this, it should be a lot more bearable. There's my jump. As you can see, it only is one. It's still not perfect, right? This needs a little bit of adjustment in terms of in terms of how the animation is being interpolated. Maybe change a curve or two. But in general, this is sort of like what we're looking for when it comes to our gameplay. We want a boomerang shape, allowing the player to use the edges of the worm. And you want to be able to change directions. Now, this is, of course, a little bit too jarring. So in this case, I'm pressing, I've made it so that the rotation happens in one direction, but if you let go, it will basically always go towards the net. This obviously presents a problem, since if you let go, it immediately cancels out the old input. That's a bit of a problem. You need to be able to change that on the fly. So I might make create some kind of function that manages this, maybe lerps or in terms between the values, so that whenever you change it, right, there is like a slight lerp between the two, so it's not as jarring as you might see here, right? As you can see, I'm doing these things that would most likely break the game, especially since they're kind of instantaneous movements, and that's not what you want. On the other hand, it also presents the question, do you really want animation canceling? Now, that's where you really want to test the game first to see if animation canceling is something that can be effectively utilized by the player. Because, first of all, it would be much easier if I simply lock the player into this forward rotation. Once you use it, that's the end of that. And there could be like a little bit of a ceiling for it, right? Whenever you want to do this, but there's also a little bit of an issue when it comes to rotation. You will notice that my rotation is running from the center of the object and not from the actual top of the or the apex of the object, and this is a little bit of a problem as well, so I might have to rectify that. Generally speaking, you would be making this, like you'd be doing the back flip or the front flip or whatever flip currently we're using in an animation in itself. So the flip itself would be an animation, and you would be able to, to have your pivots at the appropriate location. But it's definitely not a big deal. That being said, there's also another thing that you might want to consider, and that is, of course, that since we're running a local multiplayer, we are having a little bit of an issue when it comes to our actual player, composition. In other words, currently, I believe I need to raise this a little bit higher, so that we get to see stuff. This is definitely not the best way to be setting these, but as you can see, my original pawn, my pawn number 1 is moving, but this one does not receive any, it doesn't receive any animations. And that is because the second pawn runs on its own logic. Now, if this was inherited, like if this pawn was inheriting from the original pawn, in a situation like this, the best possible approach would be to have one base class of a worm and then inherit from it for player 1 and for player 2, and then in player 1 and player 2 override the appropriate things, such as player 1 input left right or player 2 input left right. Like such things should be overridden. But because I'm trying to really show you every single aspect of it, if you don't do that, it's not the end of the world. You can definitely work with that as well. The only difference is that you need a second animation blueprint, because if you remember, Our current animation blueprint is P1, and it runs based off of player 1's settings. And you will also see we don't really have a is grounded variable here. That's another thing that we could have circumvented by basically inheriting from it. And it's not really late to inherit. You could still just delete this and inherit from player 1. You'd still have to replace a bunch of stuff, or you could simply make player 1 base and just inherit P1 and P2 from it. I might do this at the end just to show you how this would look like, but for now I'll simply create another variable is grounded, and I will set this to public over here. We'll be setting this to is grounded to true, because of course it is if you land here. This is hopefully not going to get executed because I simply did this in case we have something else. I don't even know why I did this, because generally speaking, the cast, like if the cast fails, it shouldn't fail because we only are testing against the terrain itself. But you could have a secondary degree of just an extra safety type deal over here, just in case. This will, like I said, it will probably never get executed. Then you've got the actual grounded bit here, which you also might want to do with the jump, and just for extra safety to have the double jump. Again, it doesn't really matter since you want the gravity to be enabled in this case, actually here. And once we hit it, you want it to be disabled and then enabled if whatever hits the thing, right? So whenever we've landed, we disable the gravity, and say that in this case actually it is grounded. So I kind of confused this with the gravity. We want to set this to false like this. So we compile. Now, one way to do this would be to go back to the animation blueprint, which I do want to touch upon, by the way. I may have lied to you about the caching. I am not sure why or if it's possible to cache stuff in the animation blueprint, because there's two ways to actually initialize this. One is to begin play, which is called whenever the owning object of this animation, fires off its begin play. So you could do stuff on begin play, and you can also have initialize animation, which is the animation blueprint's begin play. It's kind of different because this is fired from the object and this is from the actual animation. Really, I think there's very little difference between the two, but hey, you never know. Maybe you might need both of them. Unfortunately, none of these casts, as you can see, I have to do this per update, which, like I said before, is fairly, it's expensive, but it's nothing major, right? At least for something like this, casting all the time is definitely not a big deal, especially in a small game like this. But as you get more and more objects, this might turn into an issue. I was under the impression that you could essentially run this once, just like in any other event graph, etc., where you can just cache a reference to an object and then simply use the reference, which is what it should be, how in my mind it should be working. However, that's not the case, either because the actual begin play or the initialize animation happens before the object gets created and all the casts fail. But I can't really get another firing pin off, so I'm not sure how to get that done. Or for some reason the references don't get updated or just lose their... I don't know, maybe it just can't hold references. I have no idea why this happens. Maybe you'll have more luck, do your own thing. Maybe you'll have more success in caching stuff. But this works, right? Whenever your caching stuff doesn't work, simply dump it into the update animation and it will work. Okay, as you can see, the very same reference that I'm using right now that I've set will be operating just fine as long as I keep setting it in the update, and it won't work if I set it begin play or initialize animation. And as far as I know, these are the only two pins that fire off once, and they fire off whenever either the object's begin play happens or the animation blueprints sort of begin play happens, where the initialize animation is. I'm going to delete these because honestly I can't be bothered right now or at any point in this video series to set up the proper caching system and see what the hell is going on. So I'm very happy with this. Okay, as long as it works, I'm fine. Again, this is just the mechanical bit of it. Easiest way to do this again would be to simply go to the animations, and one way would be to duplicate this and simply replace P1s with P2 and it'll work. Another way you could do, for example, you could create a child blueprint class. This could be P2. And over here, you will see that we should have inherited a bunch of stuff. As you can see, all of these things are inherited. You could presumably override these. I believe they should be overridable. There we go, update animation. You should override these, right? So you could create, like, for this to happen realistically, you need to create a player type deal. So everything that is player specific would need to have its own function, and then you could override that function in the child. Now, I really don't think I should bother setting this up because I only gonna have 2 players. So I'm gonna do this the old-fashioned way. I'm just gonna duplicate this thing and recreate. Just change a couple of references here and there to make it work. But for a bigger project, definitely opt for the inheritance option, where you want to inherit the basic functionality and then add the player-specific stuff to that functionality. Especially since if we take a look, currently we only have the event graph. Unfortunately, the actual, you will notice that the actual animation graph is exactly the same, and really it should be, because like the animations should be the same, everything should be the same except the event graph. I don't know, I'm not gonna do this right now. I might tinker with this and just set this up so that you can see how this would look like in parallel with the player 2 setup that I've done before. But both are legitimate ways of making this work. As you can see, you got overrides here for the jump, for the land, and for the idle walk. Again, this really shouldn't be an issue because at the end of the day, they should share the same animations. Now, that being said, I do think that I will make the inheritance, but I will have to create some adjustments here. So, like a function that takes the player controller and for example, the pawn owner, or some such, that I should be able to just replace these with whatever it is I'm thinking of using, right? So there's that. All right, guys. I think that's it. There's not really much to talk about here. So in the next video, we'll be talking about the HUD, the menu system, the widget system, all of that stuff, like how the scores are going to be, how we're going to keep the score, etc. We're going to do a few a few things in the game mode just to see how we would define some game rules, and then spawn everything onto the screen. So this will probably be another 1 or 2 videos. Probably 3 at most. Now, in the meantime, I will recreate this in whichever fashion I see fit. I still don't know which route I'm gonna take, because I don't want to recreate the animation graph. But just changing these 2 references was gonna be much easier than just refactoring this whole thing. Again, none of these are complex, by the way. Like, it's not like it's difficult to refactor this. Okay, so that's basically it. Oh yeah, one more thing. I had to change the velocity vector to the get last movement input vector and simply drive the Y through. As you can see, the player 1 worm, in the player controller, worm controller, we're feeding the axis value in the world direction Y, which adds an input vector to player 1 worm, and then we're grabbing the player 1 worm last input vector that's being consumed, and we're checking this, adding this to the axis. This allows us to actually use this axis in the over here in the idle walk to drive our blend space. So this is how the idea of it working is. Now, of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's really loads of different things you could do. I'm gonna leave them to you for you to discover. In the next video, I might just give you a quick rundown of how I set it up, but it shouldn't take more than a minute or 2. Therefore, you should consider this to be the final video, well, the final video for the animation system in Unreal. It's definitely not the most in-depth video, and I kind of omitted a lot of things about montages and how you can fire them off, because you can definitely, the idea is montages should be like just montage. They should be able to play them from over here. So you just create montage and play. Sorry, my bad. Montage and play. And then over here you define which montage you want, what kind of values, like how long do you want it to run. There's a montage type. And you could also return value of how long you've been playing, and you've got different breaks and whatnot. Like animation, montage itself is probably worthy of a video on its own, but specifically for that, there's plenty of videos out there on YouTube explaining how this thing works. Therefore, I have chosen to omit it. And honestly, once you get your toes wet, you will really figure out how montages work. And again, just follow this principle. If it's something that fires off based on a state, or like is a persistent thing, use the animation graph and create a state machine. That's where you should drive your thing from there. If it's driven by something that is always changing, such as player input, speed, height, etc., you should drive this through, through a blend space. And of course, if it's something that is just out of the blue, or has to get fired off once, or needs to have a particular, how should I say, continuity between it. So if you have several different animations and you need a continuity between those, use montage, right? And maybe try a compilation or whatever it was. I never tried that one, so I don't know what that does. Now that being said, that is it, guys. I'll see you next time when we start talking about the HUD, and then we will go over a polishing pass, because of course we can't just let this go and stay like this, right? This is just hideous. And as you can see, it allows for some pretty funny situations. We'll also be adding a bunch of other doodads, etc. Especially when it comes to working with the net. I don't know if we will make the net dynamic. In other words, like an actual cloth net, or this will require us to actually rig the damn thing. So we'll see. We'll see how it's gonna go. Oh, there's the ball. That was quite a good launch. But as of now, this is pretty much as much work as I'm intending to do in terms of making this prettier, because now we have a movement system and a sort of okay well, that's not okay, it's really garbage, but it's a functional animation system. Like at this point, I can simply replace animations and everything will work just fine. So if I decide to maybe change the walk cycle, I could just easily do that. I could do the jump. Maybe I could even create a backflip and simply add it to the state machine, or maybe fire it off in a montage. And if I decide to do that, I will go over montages with you. All right. Now you guys get on with your projects, figure out how you're going to perform this, and don't worry about optimizations just yet. Just run it the way you think you should. Just make it work, okay? First make it work, then optimize. That's the idea, okay? Don't make it look pretty. Don't boggle yourself with curves, how things should be working. Just set up the framework first, and then polish, then balance, then set up, then just tinker around. That's the fun. That's the most fun aspect of, well, maybe not the most fun, but it's definitely the most interesting, because everything you do the changes will get updated, and you will see really quick results. Like it's almost as if your work of setting up the baseline, the framework, is being paid off. So there's that. All right. Okay, guys. I'll see you next time. Now, bye bye.